Shares of Tylenol maker Kenvue rebounding this morning. They fell sharply yesterday on controversial comments from President Trump about Tylenol. Angelica Peebles joins us right now with more on this. And this is an announcement, Angelica, that really shook things up yesterday.
Yeah, Becky, the Trump administration advising pregnant women against taking acetaminophen. That's the active ingredient in Tylenol during pregnancy. And they also moved to approve a drug for the symptoms of autism. So the FDA is starting the process of updating the label of Tylenol and other products that contain that pain reliever to reflect evidence suggesting that taking the drug while pregnant may be associated with a higher risk of neurological conditions like autism. And President Trump told pregnant women in that press briefing yesterday not to take Tylenol more than 24 times without offering any new evidence on why exactly they are recommending that. And FDA now sending a letter to doctors that says, well, an association between acetaminophen and autism has been described in many studies. A causal relationship has not been established, and there are contrary studies in the scientific literature. The association is an ongoing area of scientific debate, and clinicians should be aware of the issue in their clinical decision making. The FDA also moving to approve an old GSK drug to treat the symptoms of autism, and GSK stopped selling the brand name of that drug, Leucovorin, almost 30 years ago. But updating that label will help the generic versions of Leucovorin add that indication to their labels. So it's a little confusing, but a GSK spokesperson telling me the company has no plans to bring that brand name drug back to the market, Becky.
Angelica, I was just saying, I know people who went to get prescriptions for this yesterday. I know the confusion that this is causing for pregnant women in particular. And there are physicians groups that are kind of pushing back on all of this and saying, wait, you should not be sowing this, in their words, misinformation on some of these issues, that this needs to be more thoroughly researched before you can say this, and that, in fact, it's very dangerous for a woman to not take something to bring down a high fever when she's pregnant. That can be big issues for the baby as well. So there's a lot of confusion that has come out as a result of this.
There's so much confusion. I mean, I see it on my own social media, right, with all of the different moms groups asking about this. And the takeaway that I've heard from doctors is that this is an area of research, right? The connection between taking acetaminophen during pregnancy and autism. It is not a totally out of left field idea to talk about. It has been studied, but really our evidence is mixed as best. Yeah, it's worth being studied. The evidence is mixed at best. But at this point, to draw conclusions, and I thought that's why it was important to show what the FDA is actually telling doctors. Because if you listen to the press conference yesterday, you might come away with the idea that you really should not take Tylenol only in very limited circumstances. But the FDA itself is acknowledging that this is not a definitive, and this is not a definitive, case closed, you should not take Tylenol situation. And so I think people do need to be measured and go look at what the FDA is saying, and also, some of what those studies are showing as well.
We know for sure that there's a lot of other things, even if it is, does factor into the overall equation. There's a lot of other genetic, environmental, a lot of other things. Maybe it's one of the environment, maybe, but where were the studies in Sweden, the sibling studies, where it just didn't look like
larger studies, by the way,
and even larger. But that doesn't prove it's not. But it doesn't prove there's nothing.
And that's the problem, Joe. You mentioned a good point, and that's when you talk to all of the different researchers out there. You really can't run the studies that we want, the randomized placebo-controlled trials. You're not going to give a pregnant woman the option to say, hey, there's this thing that we think might give your kid autism. Do you want to potentially take it? And then we'll give you we won't give it to you. So you can't run those studies. And that means that it's really hard to prove that something does not cause autism, and that's just going to leave open this gap for any possibility. And, people obviously want answers. This is a huge issue. But at the same time, I think people in general are skeptical that suddenly, 6 months in, we have an answer that we haven't been looking for, despite decades of research and billions of dollars in the area.
Well, if I was going to be your assignment editor, so which I'm not, there's a piece in the Journal which highlights an op-ed piece. You probably saw it, but the whole idea of placebo-controlled drugs are almost impossible in certain things. With people that have advanced melanoma that are going to die, you can't give, if you're testing a drug, you can't give the placebo to people if it works. And this drug seems to work. And the guy who's in charge right now says, well, there were no placebo, and he's a Bernie Sanders acolyte. that is now in, an RFK Jr. Appointee, I think. So, just to say, well, too many cancer drugs are being approved. There's another camp that says you ought to approve almost all of them if there's the slightest chance for people that are, in dire straits for a couple of extra months or whatever. Some of them might work. So did you see that piece today? You probably know more about it. I'm not familiar with the drug, but it's for advanced melanoma. And the criticism is there was no placebo on this trial that showed a third were reduced, or a third were completely obliterated, the cancer, and the other ones did shrink. So I don't know what's going on at the FDA right now, or HHS, or whatever we want to talk about. This one is...
Yeah, there's certainly debate about, how we should be looking at placebos and how we should be running trials. And I think, again, back to that drug, leucovorin, there have been some small studies that suggest that maybe it does have an effect. Maybe it does help some kids who are nonverbal, be able to make improvements in terms of their autism symptoms. But same thing here. Yes, not all studies can have, hundreds, thousands of patients. But when you're talking about a disease like autism that's so prevalent, that really is a place where you want to see those large studies.